Well, thanks everyone. My name is Don Houk. I ran a small business, an IT consulting company called Next 7 IT. Ran it for 15 years, started in 2010, and recently sold it in June of this year. So I'll talk through a lot of content about how that happened, how to start a business, how to build it and sell it. But Dr. Crude asked me to come do a Q&A to start, so any questions that you might have about how you might start a business, grow it, sell it, or just anything in general, I'd be glad to answer any questions that you have. Just get started. So I think, and this is really going to be part of the speech too, so you'll get it twice here, but the really is, it's so complicated, some of the stuff related to business, and a lot of people can just get easily overwhelmed with it. So instead of getting overwhelmed, just take it bit by bit. You don't have to know everything right away to get started. You can just start and learn it as you go. So she was asking about what the discovery process was. Well, I was in the industry to start, so I think that generally is helpful if you're going to start a business about something. Is, well, if you're in IT but you go start a restaurant, well, what do you know about the restaurant business? That's not really all that useful. So if you are in the industry, that's generally a good place to start. And if you're not and you want to start a business, well, you can maybe go straight into a business, but it's usually helpful to get some experience first in the industry that you're interested in, and then you can take that experience and grow. And that's what I did. I graduated in 2003, and for the first 6 years I worked in industry, learned a little bit about IT in general, and then I was able to notice that there was a lot of problems related to small business IT support in particular. Notice there's a huge need around that. You had big companies out there, they all have these huge IT departments. Small businesses need the same thing, but they weren't adequately being serviced, so I wanted to take advantage of that. Great question, thank you. How did I fund my startup costs? Didn't have any. The nice thing about IT, and this is the nice thing and probably the hard thing about IT and managed services in general, is there's very low barriers to entry. You really just need a computer and being able to go out and work hard. And so it didn't require me to get a loan or have big capital expenditures. So in that case, it didn't, it just the nature of that particular industry. Not every industry is going to be like that. But so that's the good side of it. The bad side of that is that you get a lot of competitors because the barriers are so low. So just keep that in mind. You're going to have to outcompete a lot of people when the barrier to entry is a lot lower. No, it's a good question, is who are you going to sell to? Great, you got to figure that out. Who's going to be your target market in that? And then what kind of approach are you going to take to do it? So IT in general was a lot of break-fix work. In other words, we come out, you break a printer, we come fix it. But managed IT services is actually much better, and that's recurring revenue model. So, and I would recommend this generally, to the extent that you can create a recurring revenue model in your business, that ends up being really critical because it's much easier to maintain that. And two, if you ever do want to sell, contracted recurring revenue is king, because then they know they're going to buy the business, and then it's not going to immediately just walk out the door the next day. It creates consistency. You can hire better in that situation. It doesn't have the ebbs and flows of pure project-based. Now, we did do a lot of projects, but we only really did projects when we had a managed IT services contract behind it. So that made the whole thing much easier to grow and scale. And you don't have that, if you go really high watermark of a lot of work, and then all of a sudden your work just dries up, what are you going to do? You have all these expenses, all the people that you had, you're going to lay them off, you're going to try and float that. That can be a tough conversation. So, and again, every industry is going to be a little bit different, but it's particularly in IT, and I think generally, if you can do a recurring revenue model, that tends to work out pretty well. Ask the snowflake guy. AI will figure that out for you. No, I mean, there's a threshold by which you probably need to pivot, but I tend to think most people pivot too soon, and they don't actually put forth the effort necessary to really solve the problem. So either there's going to be an obstacle, and generally that obstacle is going to be the way. There's actually a good book about that. Obstacle is the way I recommend it. But try to try harder, I guess, in those situations, and you probably need to put forth a little more effort than you think you do. But you do have to, I think financially, this can be the litmus test is at what point do we run out of cash? What point have we invested too much? And usually it's probably a good idea to have a threshold set before you start it. So like, I'm gonna try this out and we're gonna hit this threshold in either time or money. And then once we're at that point, it's gonna be a reflection. Do we continue? Are we making the progress that we want? Or do we need to pivot and either abandon that effort? And you see that all the time. Like Apple will put in a ton of effort into a particular product and millions of dollars, and like, nope, that didn't work. Sorry, we lost $1 million. But you know, it happens with big companies too. So not everything is going to work out perfectly. I was really fortunate looking back. The first person I hired was really good, and hiring a lot of people since then, I've started realizing how fortunate that actually was. But he stayed with me for about 8 years. He moved to California, and I wish he could have stayed longer. But yeah, the first hire for me was technical in nature because I was a technical business, and I was handling everything. But the tech part of it, I needed to scale first, and so that was the first one that we brought on, and then we continued to add techs. We were actually very lean overall in terms of anything beyond techs. We had a couple administrative assistants at the end, but beyond those two, everybody else was a tech, and that was mostly because of our excessive focus on customer service and making sure that the client had the best experience. That was really our model for growth. It wasn't driven by sales and having a lot of this administrative. We tried to keep our admin really low, so we didn't, but we did. One of the first things we did was hire a bookkeeper, so that a lot of external folks to help supplement internal, so that we're not the ones pushing the button. You really don't want to hire, like as a leader, be the one pushing your accounting buttons all the time, but you do need to understand what it all means. One of our core values was integrity, and I think it starts there. You got to be doing the right thing no matter what. And I think any business can serve the greater good in a lot of different ways. So, for us, that was making sure that all of our clients were doing a great job and were being effective. And they all have people that work for them that are dependent on their businesses. So we're in our way helping them. One of our approaches, I think might speak to what you're trying to get at here, is when we were going to sell to customers, we weren't doing it from a perspective of, well, I'm going to make more money when I do this. We're doing it from a perspective of, I'm trying to take ownership of their environment as if I was part of it. So if I'm them, how would I want to be treated? And so in those ways, I think that's demonstrating integrity. But it was also, clients love that. Like they don't want to be sold to. They don't want somebody to sit there and try to convince them to buy something. They want somebody to say, you know what, you really shouldn't buy this. In your situation, we sell this to other companies, but you know what, it doesn't make sense for you. That I think creates a lot of goodwill, so that when I do have to come back to them and say, look, you really need this thing because you truly do, I think that's a much better and more ethical way to sell, and I think it worked out well for us. What role did passion play? I think, at least to me, it was more about work ethic and executing day in and day out. You do need to have passion in what you're doing, but you also need to balance that with not every day is going to be a passionate experience. You know what I mean? So you're going to... Yeah. So you can, if you're coming at it from a purely emotional side of things, you will wear out. And there were many times where it felt like, can we even continue? You hit some rough patches, you lose customers, you have some rough times. So, you got to understand that it's not always going to be rainbows and butterflies in those situations, but it's more about having that work ethic that will get you through those times. So. You also don't want to pick an industry that you hate, okay? So don't, just because something can make a lot of money doesn't necessarily mean that's for you, right? So you got to make sure that you are actually interested in it. So for me, I loved IT. I started when we brought this magical box home in the 90s back when it was like, what does this thing do? And I remember my dad was like, don't touch anything. Like, this is going to be really bad. Like, but we turned it on and like, wow, you could type into it and do these things. And, so like to me, that drew me in. So yeah, good question. It was both. There's things you gotta hit a certain threshold before it becomes interesting to even consider it in terms of the value of the business. But also, it's not selling for is not for everybody. You may want to continue in a business. A lot of people do grow a business all the way to you retire and then you move on. I had other interests that I wanted to do, so I wouldn't want to stay in one place forever. I was in there for 15 years, and which is a long time. The prior jobs was about 3 years each. I get antsy and wanted to move on, but this one kept my interest for a little bit longer. So it depends. There's no real clear-cut answer to that. I think there's definitely the monetary side because you're not going to get any offers when you first start out and you've got 2 clients and they're giving you $2 each. So that's not going to be, but you get to a point where that becomes interesting, and then it's a question of whether or not it makes sense for you personally. So yeah, and only you can answer that one. You're going to run into a lot of roadblocks. There's going to be things that are come out of left field that you're not expecting, and you have to be able to navigate those. And one of the things I think is helpful in that is to not freak out, okay? Like, don't just lose your mind about it because it's going to happen. And if you're upset about it, your employees are going to see that, and then they're going to become doubly upset about it. And so really staying calm in those environments and being the voice of reason to your employees. And that means you got to sit and think about it. Like, you got to figure out what's our path here. There's going to be multiple, depending on what the scenario is, you're going to have to figure out what the path is. So, for example, we had a client. It was our largest client, and they went bankrupt. We weren't expecting that. They went bankrupt. And so we had to pivot really quickly. Like, what are we going to do? This is a huge source of our revenue that's coming in. Do we have to lay people off? So, it's going to take some effort to figure out what that runway looks like, and then how can I sell into this? How can I replace that revenue? And then come back with a plan to the rest of the employees so they know, okay, this was bad, but we've got a plan to address it.
All right, I'll make this an easy one. Did you ever fire a client? And talk me through that.
We did fire a client. We fired 3 clients, I think. Yeah, it was about 3. Yeah, not everyone's going to be a fit. Not every customer is going to be a fit. You can go into them. We tried really hard to make sure that it was going to be a two-way street when we're talking with them. We turned down a lot of clients just because they weren't into our model. So our model was very heavy on proactivity, finding gaps in their current service, and giving them advice on how to fix those gaps, remediate. If we came to them with a list of things they needed to do to improve and they just told us no all the time, that would go find a cheaper service, right? And so we would try to sort that out in the get to know you phase of that. We weren't always successful, and we had situations where they just didn't see the value in it. But usually, even in that scenario, the biggest thing was when they started to get aggressive with our team. That was really the point in which I was like, you could have conversations like, hey, we got to think about how we're talking to our team members here in this situation. You can do that. But some of the personalities, you're talking to business owners, and they're not going to really care what you say because you're a vendor. So, those situations we've had to, just move on and say, let me help you transition you to somebody that might be a better fit. The tendency of that, I think the larger clients tend to do that more than anybody else because they know they're the big fish and they can kind of get their way in certain things that maybe others don't. But for the most part, we had pretty good customers and they were reasonable. They knew that they weren't the only person we were servicing. But we were also really good at responsiveness no matter what. So they didn't necessarily feel like they had to push us around too much. And so to the extent that you can provide that level of service, then they're not going to demand more because they're already getting it. So the second one, no, we didn't really have a lot of risk in it because one, it was just me, and I was fortunate enough to be in the industry and knew people, so it was easy for me to get clients initially. So I was blessed in that we were able to start out without that kind of risk. As far as the marketing side goes, I am not your person for sales. I was not good at sales. We didn't have a huge sales engine. We were good at getting referrals. We were able to build the business organically. And it's interesting because we just sold the business, and I'm able to see we're one of like 85 other managed IT service providers. And so we can actually peel back and see a little bit what's happening. And it's interesting. We had probably the least amount of churn in sort of terms of lost customers out of probably anybody in the platform. And I think that's because we did a really good job on customer service. But because we didn't lose customers, we didn't have to have a huge sales engine. We just were asked for referrals. We were able to organically add them on. And the advantage of that is that because we're doing it more slowly over time, we can still service our existing customers without them feeling like they're all of a sudden turning into a number and like, oh, you were really good until you brought on all these new entities and now service has declined. And that's when you start losing customers. And it's just so much easier to keep your existing ones than it is to replace them. That's a real good question because I think a lot of companies are like, ooh, revenue? Sure, we'll take it. And this is the problem, I think, when you have a sales department that maybe doesn't have limits or structure around it, because if you just hire a salesperson, you give them a commission, what are they going to do? They're going to go sell, right? And sometimes they will sell things that are difficult to support. So you really want to make sure, now I don't have a ton of experience doing this because we never had a salesperson, but if I did, I would want to make sure that they knew what the threshold was and that we would have somebody on the customer service side validate that what we're selling is going to be serviceable. So the worst thing you can do is bring on a huge customer and then get so overloaded with work that you start losing customers out the backside. So that revenue is not worth anything if you just lose it all on the other side of it. So yeah, having a threshold for that. We were picky in terms of the total number of employees that we would support for a customer. So our sweet spot was in that 25 to 75 employee range. Once you start getting above that, you can still support it if they have an internal IT person. So there was criteria that we would look at. But if we had like a gigantic school district, that had thousands of people, and they're like, "Can you be our IT?" Like, no. That would crush we're not staffed for that. And if we did staff for it, it would draw so much attention away from what we needed to do. So that's not to say we couldn't have that as a long-term goal and set up and prep ourselves to get there, but you can't just like, yep, I'm going to take it and figure it out. Like, you got to prep and be sure you're ready to take it on. Yeah, that's a good question. When you're real small, it's real easy because it's just me and maybe two other people, so you're all kind of hanging out and you get to know each other. There's not a whole lot of overhead or management necessary. The challenge comes when you start putting management into the equation, and it really requires significant buy-in in those managers, because instead of them interacting with me, they're going to interact with this other person instead. And so that person needs to have good habits, needs to be buying into the way that we respond to customers, demonstrating how to act. So those are, you manage that through making sure you're communicating a lot with them and having those one-on-one conversations. And then also hire to your core values. So make sure everyone understands what your core values are. We had them up on the wall, and we would go over them for every new hire. We would discuss, this is who we are, this is how we respond, and we go through that. Make sure that people are living it and hold them accountable to that. To a certain degree, there's always a bit of slippage. Whenever you start going into having other people do stuff, there's going to be some testing of the limits, and that communication, I think, has to be going into those situations to address it. But it is a challenge, though. Once you start putting in management, and I don't know that we solved this equation and made it perfect, but those were some of the things that I did. small businesses do come in all shapes and sizes. There are going to be ones with limited resources, and a part of it is how much are they believing in needing IT support or whatever product or service you have. We had a more educational kind of sales process where people had to really get buy-in on what the model was and understand what they were going to get out of it. So but it can be a challenge though to understand when they have limited resource. Our nonprofits were probably the most difficult to work with because they were. There you go, Peter. Peter's laughing about that. Because they have limited budgets. So now there's ways around that. Can you help them get grants to get through that? Like those are some of the things you can think about there. But the reality is that some of them are going to be very cash strapped, and you got to ask, is it going to be a good customer for us? So, so if they're so limited in resources or process that they can't afford your service, then that'll solve itself. But you got to also educate them on what it is that you're selling and make sure that they have the capacity to actually want that. We did have a number of nonprofits. City Rescue Mission was one of those, and so in those cases, and I actually grew up around that area, so we would help them out in certain ways that maybe we wouldn't in others, so we want all of our customers to be successful regardless of what they are, and that's really the point of what we're doing, and that really should be the point of any business, is to try and help other people succeed in life in some way. You're providing a need, you're providing a service to them. So in those cases, we'll look at that, but it's not always about dollars, right? Like you're out there to help. We're only here for a very short period of time in the grand scheme of things. So the humanity of things comes in, and really that makes it hard too when you have employees, and you're a business, but you have employees, like that. You're going to have that conflict, and that's not an easy one to solve either. Yeah, I think do the right thing. Like that was the idea. I wanted to make sure that we were not going to take advantage of anybody. We're not there to go after dollars above everything else, and make sure that flows down in there. So the best way to do that is to demonstrate it. So when you see something like if we overbilled a customer, well, maybe they didn't notice it, we're still going to refund them, right? Like you got to have that kind of mindset of, even if, we would maybe, no, we don't get away with it. Like you're still going to think about that, and that's going to bug you, right? Like you can't, so demonstrate that, and then make sure that everyone on your team is demonstrating that as well. It's just living it, I think, on a day in, day out basis. Yeah, there's a number of different options when you go to sell. The two that popped up were, there's both for private equity. There was a roll-up strategy, and then there was a buy and hold strategy. We chose the buy and hold because it was much less disruptive to our customers. When I was talking with one of the roll-up private equity companies, and I was asking them, like, oh, you're going to do all this consolidation that's probably going to cause some disruption to your customers. How many customers typically do you lose? Like, yeah, we expect that our clients are going to lose about 20% of their customers. It's like, ooh, yeah, I don't really feel great about that, So the consolidation part wasn't good, and then you lose the identity of the business after that. And so the buy and hold was the approach we took, largely because that model was most closely what I kind of wanted to see in the long term for the business. Yeah, I did think about it sooner. There was one part of the business, probably the hardest part, when we just lost a big customer. We had a few people leave, employees left, and it was probably the lowest part of the business for me. And so I think in that moment, it was like, can I keep going here? So for a minute, I thought maybe we would sell, and it wouldn't have been worth it to do so, and that contributed. But I didn't feel like we had finished the work and got it to the point where I felt it could be successful on its own. At that point, there was no keeping it going post-transaction, it would just be, yeah, we're just going to take your clients, and that's going to be it. And that wasn't appealing to me. So, yeah, I think there was that, but that was more out of more of a, like a desperation kind of thing, and that wasn't the right reason to do it either. And so, you know, for me, I was like, well, if I can just put some more hard work into this, we can recover from it, create a plan, got out of it, and get to a point where I can feel more comfortable about it, then that was the way I wanted to go. So, but yeah, that's how we did it. For me, my hardest part, and maybe this is just my personality, was the HR side. You know, my sister is in HR. That's what she does. And somehow she likes that. But I did not. It was not, but I was much more into the process side of it, and we ended up hiring other people that could help with the HR things, and I think that was helpful. But yeah, people are going to be the reason for your success and the reason for your pain, both of those things. And so you're just going to have to deal with it. You know, we weren't a retail shop where we're losing people like every 3 months, but it's always a challenge as a small business. You think we're in a scenario where we have a 4-person company, 1 person moves on. You just lost 25% of your workforce right there. So that's a big deal, right? When you get to be larger, it wasn't as big of a problem. And that was actually a big problem for us for sales too. When we'd run up against other competitors that were larger and we only had 3 or 4 people, they're just like, you're too small. You can't service us. And we'd lose a lot of deals because we were too small. They didn't know that they were actually going to get a better result with us because, you know, we tried to convince them to talk to our customers. That's probably the best way if you're in that scenario, to convince somebody to buy from you if they're like, you're too small. Like, well, this client's the same size as you. Talk to them and see what their experience is. And even then, you know, either they wouldn't do it or they'd still be like, no, this one's bigger. Bigger is not always better. But either way, like we got crushed with that probably until we got to about the 10-person mark. And then they were like, okay, now you're a little bit more legit. And then once you get to about 20, then they don't care. Like, okay, you're about the right size. So yeah, that's the good and the bad. But the HR, I think, was the most, just because you got to deal with the turmoil of changing and dealing with you know, new people coming in and hiring and letting people go, that kind of stuff. The process is really important. I think it's the number one thing that especially small businesses don't have. A lot of them just want to wing it, not a good plan. Have a process for how you do just about everything. I'll go into more depth on that when we talk. Yeah, I like process. I like figuring out what we can do to improve it, make it better. How can we automate it? How do we not do this thing to begin with? So I don't know, this is going to be a little bit generic answer because I think it probably depends on the scenario and what it is you're trying to solve and what the tool you need to fix it and solve it. So, yeah, but having a process-oriented mindset, I see a lot of times where people will throw humans at a problem that a system should solve. And so coming at it from a system-based mindset, is there a way we can automate this, especially now? So many options around this. Like, do we even need somebody to do it? But trying to minimize the amount of work necessary to get a work product, I think, you know, at least for me, that was the mindset I would have on it. Is like try to not create a system that would pull us out. So, for example, we had our proactive service process. So this is where we would go out every quarter to every customer and we'd do a series of actions. It would be to audit them, we'd be doing updates for them, things like that. And I knew everything we would add to that would require a human to do something. So we were very careful about putting new things on without causing a lot of hours invested into that. So it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it does mean we want to be cautious and think about the method in which we're doing it. Because there's a lot of ways to solve something. There's the really long, but it gets there. But can we get there the same way without putting as much effort in? But you don't have to figure that all the right away. You can start and then make incremental improvements over time on it too. That was one of the things I was worried about too, is how that was going to go down. And I wasn't sure because I hadn't sold a business before. So I really didn't know what the response was going to be. I think we had a pretty good message with the scenario we were in because we did have a buy and hold. It was a company that had demonstrated success with other businesses in our area that they knew of. So I think that was an easier message. And it provides a little more opportunity for them as well, because now they're part of a larger entity that they could have some upward mobility within. So, emphasizing the points that are good in that. And also, this was legit too, they did not want to get rid of anybody. This was not an acquisition where, okay, well, we're going to reduce your workforce by 10%, or these people are good and these people. No, they were going to keep everybody. They wanted that because we're a service-based business. If they fired all everyone there, they're not going to be able to do any work. So I think all those things provided some comfort. But I don't think you're ever going to make it like 100%, I feel really good about everything when you introduce change like that, because people are just naturally going to be like, well, this might go sideways and I'm stuck in the middle. So, but yeah, that was a tough thing to have to do. So I'm not going to be able to compete in the same industry as them. I can't go start another managed IT service provider. I wouldn't want to anyway, so I don't think that's something that was super impactful to me. But yeah, you're going to be running into that in that situation because, from their perspective, I know everything about that business, and it would be very easy for me to replicate it again. So they don't want me to do that, then become competitive to them, and that's understandable. So just because my mindset was, I didn't want to go back into that space, at least not in the next 5 years. It wasn't a big deal, but that's a consideration for other folks. If you're going to sell, you can negotiate that. That's part of the process. If that's important to you, no, this is what I'm planning to do, and they'll either say yes or no, and maybe they'll say yes, but they're going to reduce something else. You can work around it, but certainly a good point, something to think about. The balance with work and personal life for a small business owner is difficult. And I'd say really, if you're going to be successful in anything, it's going to be a challenge. But it comes down to priorities. For me, how much can I give to work? How much do I need to give personally? And just set boundaries on that. I knew when I was off, I would need to be focused on my kids. Okay, good. But then be 100% present in those moments that you do have with them. So a lot of times people will spend a lot of time physically present, but not really there. Do you know what I mean? So in the moments that you do have, making the most of them and really engaging, being fully present in that moment and not be thinking about, I need to solve this problem or that problem at work. And I think that helps in a situation. Because you do have to put in a lot of hours. I'm sure, Rich, you had to put in tons of hours building a business, staying late, working early, but you got to remember what's truly important at the end of the day too. It's not dollars; it's the people that we know, the relationships we have, our families. So you cannot let it consume you. It's easy to do because, especially if you're passionate about it and you like it. You will chase it, but there still has to be balance. And I think that's really the key, is make sure there's balance in your life, both personally and with work, so that one is not all-consuming over the other and vice versa. It is a mix of everything. And the thing is, you don't have to figure everything out yourself. That's why you hire people, right? Hopefully you're hiring people that are smarter than you in some way, and you can collectively bring together a process that is more functional. So we used a tool, and I'll mention this in speech, so it's preview, called Suite Process, and it was a procedure management platform, so that we would be able to collectively, as a group, have a process that we could improve. So that's really important, I think, because you don't want just a process. The process is not going to sit and exist forever. It's going to need to be changed and updated. And so as you work through that, you can make it more productive and more refined over time. So, yeah, collectively, you really got to do this. You can't, I was never one to be like, okay, it's going to be this way and this is the only way, and I don't care what anyone else says, like look, sometimes maybe you have to because you just like, this is the way, but most of the time you're going to want to include other people's perspectives on it, and then as a group comes out to, this is the best process to do. So like, for example, we had our proactive process I've talked about. We would have people that were actually executing it update the process. I'm not going in there to update their process for them. I might review it to make sure it makes sense, but I want them to be able to contribute. The people that are actually doing it, living it, have them help write that, so it's makes sense, right? Yeah, this is probably the hardest part of running a small business, is when you have to let somebody go. And we were fortunate in that, because we're so picky with hiring, this didn't happen all that frequently. We did have certainly people that needed to move on. They were going somewhere else in life, wanted to switch careers, whatever. Those were easier conversations. But when it was performance-based, those conversations are a little harder. I think just be fair and open with people, like not trying to, you're not there to beat them up. You're not trying to tell them how bad they are. Like, this is just not the right fit, right? Like, you're going to be successful in some other area in life. It's just not going to be here. So just treating them with respect in those situations is really important. But, like, for example, we had one guy that he was out at a client and he was playing a video game, like legit right on the screen. It's like, sorry, man, like, you know better than this. Like, the client's never going to let you come back there again. Like, this, you can't work here. So those are the situations that are unfortunate. You have some other ones where you're going to go through, if you're going to let somebody go, highly recommend you do a performance improvement plan with them prior to that. So in other words, don't just surprise them. It should never be a surprise when you let somebody go. You should be having, I would recommend, at least 3 conversations written, like, here's where we're at, here's where we need to be, make sure they clearly understand those goals. And then, okay, here we are again, we didn't meet those, you understand this is what the expectation is. Again, for a time, okay, all right, they're going to know why they're having that conversation. So, plus from a legal perspective, like, you want to make sure you've done all of that, so they can't come back to you and say, I was improperly fired. I'm very curious about AI, and because I'm a nerd and I love technology, and I grew up in an industry where you saw how computers took over the world. Then you had the internet; everyone's using the internet. There was cloud, and I think AI is one of those major inflection points. And so for me, that's where my focus is going to initially go. Where that will lead, that's going to depend on what comes out of that. And so that's part of it. But time is also important to me. Like, as I've gotten a little older, time becomes a little more valuable to me than a lot of other things. So, that perspective is there as well. But